Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals series for exam 210-451. Yes, Ronnie's shaking his head, so I got that right. And we're going to talk about cloud deployment models now, and we're going to focus on the public cloud first. How to check my notes.
Right.
And here he is, Mr. Ronnie Wong, to help us out.
All right, Vaughn, thank you again for joining us as we continue through, and we are into that third component of the definition that we've been hanging on to for quite a bit of time. And if you're sitting there like, why are you going so slow through these things? It's because it is testable material on the exam. And if you take a look at the idea here, okay, as we go through, we want to make sure that you don't, miss anything about this. So make sure that you get all the answers there. Now, in this particular section, I want to make sure I was actually telling you right. We're actually beginning our second domain in terms of the exam objectives, Vaughn. And this particular domain adds up to about 14% of everything that or 16% of everything that you're actually going to be asked here. And if you add that in with the first section, which I think is about another 15 or 16%, that's 30% of the exam might come from just these two exam objectives. And Vaughn, I'd hate to actually say, let me just breeze through the first two, objectives here, just to make sure that nobody will actually take a look and have to worry too much about this. I want to make sure that we get all the details in that we need to. So we're going to spend a good bit of time on a third of the exam, essentially, is what we're going to come down to do. So that's pretty much why I'm taking the time that I'm doing. But we do need to take a look at the idea of what we mean by deployment models as well.
Yeah, strong foundation builds a solid house. So you got to make sure you've got that. So always do the basics,
right?
Even when you don't want to.
That's right. So let's go ahead and get started here. So here we have the same document that we've been using, which of course is the NIST SP 800-145. This is going to be the foundational document. Remember, you can download this from NIST itself. If you're an IT Pro TV subscriber, it means that actually will be part of the show notes or downloads that you can get access to as well. So it's not completely anything. You don't have to actually memorize everything in this, but it's this definition in particular that you want to make sure that you do understand. So remember that the idea of cloud computing itself is not about the underlying technology of the way that the cloud works, because we're not actually teaching that so much. But what we're actually doing here is that what we're doing is saying, here's the model, okay? And the idea of the model, of course, is some type of access model that you and I are going to follow. And that model is composed of three different components here. We've talked about the 5 different characteristics. We've gone over 3 models. And now we are ready to dive into the idea of the 4 deployment models. So Vaughn, in a previous episode that we did, I said where we start to muddy the waters a little bit, right, is that when we come down to these 3 and 4, so those aspects, right, of the components of cloud computing, okay, and this cloud model, this is where most people get lost if they're not really familiar with the idea and the technology behind what we're actually talking about here, okay? So we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of that service model and the idea of a deployment model as well. And between episodes, Vaughn, you and I were also talking about, like, since you're actually preparing for another exam, that sometimes you hear the term release and deployment, right?
Deploy and release, which in my general thinking brain before I actually started the ITIL series, it's the same thing.
Right.
You release and deploy. In that particular arena, it is a little different.
Right.
Deploy is when you move it into a live environment, and release is when you make it available for use.
Right.
So that's what I've been looking at. But when I'm looking at this documentation and kind of how we've been talking these last couple episodes, I'm like, it's almost like the deployment models in this way, it's almost like releasing it. It's like how you're going to actually make it available for use for people. But those two words are so similar, and depending on which governing body you're underneath as a Cisco or ITIL, it can get a little weird.
It can. So I think that they almost line up, though, Vaughn. So even though we had talked about it before, it might seem like it's actually almost backwards here. The idea of the service model and the way that I described it in a previous episode, right, is essentially the infrastructure that they are making available, okay? So there's actually the service provider says, here's how I'm going to present this to everyone. We're going to either be an infrastructure, as a service, or we're going to be a platform as a service provider, or we're going to be a software as a service provider. Okay. Now they're not actually saying this is how you interact with it. Okay, but they're saying, hey, essentially this is how we are making this ready. Okay, for people to be able to say, here's what we want to be able to provide for someone. Okay, so when we take a look at the idea of the deployment, then, okay, this actually comes at it from the standpoint of the user of that cloud model, is what we're taking a look at. And so when you hear about something like this, okay, this is when we start to take a look at how do we normally access then the idea of the infrastructure or the platform or the actual software as a service. And my company can actually do that. And so how do we actually get access to this thing as well? Okay. So when we start to take a look, since we're doing this in the deployment model and we're focusing in on the public cloud, well, if I scroll down in this document, which does have each one of these things kind of listed out and defined for us, we can come down into that second section, and there it is. There's the 4 deployment models that are actually set up here for us to be able to take a look at. And I did them a little bit out of order, and what's listed right here in the NIST documents, I tried to follow closely to the exam objectives, and I put them in the order of the exam objectives unless I thought that they didn't actually match that way. So we're going to spend some time talking about the idea of the public cloud first, because this is the one that most people are more familiar with, is the idea of that public cloud. Okay, so when we take a look at the definition that's actually put here in terms of this model, okay, the cloud infrastructure is provisioned for open use by the general public. Okay, it can be owned by and managed and operated by a business, an academic, or a government type of organization, or some combination of them. It exists on the premises of the cloud provider itself. Okay. Now, in that sense of things, when we start to talk about that definition and what we mean by public cloud, is notice now we actually have the access model that we're talking about. Okay. So here, when you go and you try and say, hey, here's what I need, well, an organization may actually be able to use the infrastructure that's actually there, or the service, the software that's there, or the platform that's there. But at the same time, Vaughn, if she were an individual and not actually hired by a company, she said, look, I'm going to start doing this as part of my own ability to bring up a company and to do what I want to. Well, she could go to that same particular provider, okay, and say, hey, I want to get access to some of these same things, but I don't need it on the scale that a big company might need. Can it actually be done that way? Well, yes, it really can. So to try and draw all this stuff out, I didn't actually make the most detailed diagram, but essentially all of them kind of revolve around this model. So it's not so much that it matters about how all this stuff kind of comes in, but it's really about a couple of different things, okay? Regardless of whether you're actually a company or whether you're just a regular consumer as an individual, and regardless of the types of devices that you're on, whether it's a mobile device or a desktop device, the public cloud gives us that ability to connect usually through the internet and then gain access to whatever that cloud provider is going to do. So it doesn't matter whether it's infrastructure, it doesn't matter whether it's a platform, it doesn't matter whether it's the software that we're trying to gain access to. The only thing that matters is that we have that connection point, which could be worldwide at times, depending on what's actually there, okay, that we can gain access to it. And it doesn't even say, we're only for the companies, we're only for this aspect of things here, but it gives us that ability.
So, like Dropbox.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can access that anywhere from my mobile device. I also have, at one point, we had a company Dropbox or like a business Dropbox. I had my personal, as a consumer, Dropbox, and I can access it anywhere. And of course, yeah, as long as I had internet connection, I could get to it and be provided with my storage.
Right. So some of the advantages here in terms of the public model here, and I'm just going to do a little bit of typing because the more typing I do, the worse off my show is going to be. The reason why is even typing, my handwriting is pretty bad. Okay. So that's why. So the first thing that we want to talk about here is just essentially the idea of the scope of a public cloud. Now, usually the scope of a public cloud, because they want to gain as many customers as they can to support it, is large, okay, and maybe even global in its scope. So if we talk about something like this, okay, usually what you'll end up finding out here in terms of that actual type of service provider that's a public cloud, it means that they have infrastructure normally located in pretty, diverse geographic regions, okay? So if you think about something like AWS, okay, Amazon Web Services, or Microsoft Azure, they've got their centers hosted globally, just about every place that there is, so that what can happen is if Vaughn happens to be traveling, okay, and she's in Japan, she doesn't have to connect all the way over to a server here in, or not here, but here in the United States, let's say in Virginia, okay, to then be able to gain access to whatever service that she needs to. Vaughn should be able to connect to whatever the local or the nearest server that's actually near her to localize so that she has the same performance that she would have if she were connected right here and very close. Okay. So its scope of being able to provide what's needed is kind of where we also get that global scope and that idea of the public scope too. Okay. Now, the things that we do have to worry about that differentiate between the different deployment models, especially for the idea of the public cloud, of course, has to do with what we call different risks and challenges. Okay, so when it comes down to the global type of model here in terms of risks and challenges, well, what are some of the risks and that we actually have to think about? Okay, so when we start doing this, the first thing that we have to worry about, of course, are the idea of different security risks. Okay, now we're going to talk about just a few of the different types of security risks that we need to worry about. But overall, though, Vaughn, okay, that's what we have to think about. Now, in the idea of the public cloud and talking about the idea of security risk, data loss is a potential thing that can happen. Now, usually today there's redundancy upon redundancy that it might actually get lost, but it's usually not going to, okay? But sometimes you have to actually worry, like, because it is so widespread. Vaughn, do you know anybody that works, let's say, in other words, just a person's name, okay, that works at Amazon Web Services, just personally?
Not off the top of my
Yeah.
head.
What about anybody that works with Microsoft Azure?
With it?
Oh, yeah, actually.
Oh, like Adam Gordon?
Huh? No, that actually works there.
Oh, like actually,
Yeah.
not that I can recall off the top of my head.
What about Google Compute?
Don't know.
Okay. So I'm not actually trying to say that there's actually a great security risk in terms of us putting all our company data in the hands of people we don't know, but there has to be at least that risk that we now trust somebody with with all of our data, and we're paying for that. Now, our service level agreement and everything else should say no, of course people aren't going to do it. But how do you know if a bad actor isn't actually working in those places?
Oh, you're talking about like the inside job,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Somebody
there you go.
internally that is going to disperse all the information. This sounds familiar, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
Well, remember that these companies, they might not be one individual monolithic company, but they might also, of course, have contractors that come in that gain access to different data centers. And again, I'm not trying to say everybody has this, but you got to kind of worry about the very fact that you're trusting your data with with somebody you don't know. Okay. Now, can the same thing happen if I only store stuff not in the cloud, but only on my premises? Yeah, same things can happen. So if I worry about it because I'm actually the one that's in charge of all of the server, access that I have, well, I have to actually worry about, well, who inside of my company can gain access to my data as well? And is there a potential that I could lose it? Now, losing it is not all of a sudden that Vaughn goes to access it tomorrow, okay? And she goes, oh crap, my files are gone, okay? Losing it might actually be where Ronnie's actually snuck in with a USB or some other type of drive and plugged that into a server and did what? Made a copy of it. And now Vaughn's super secret design for whatever she says, I'm going to introduce this tomorrow and, disrupt the entire technology market by doing this. That could be a loss as well if I now have access to that technology.
And I feel like this is in the news a lot nowadays. Of course, any of these things that are public facing, global, like the biggest front facing type of businesses or services, you hear about Target getting hacked or customer data getting lost or I mean, and I'm not just singling out one particular company, like there's a bunch of them that you hear somebody's like broken in and stolen, or they've lost that customer data to other places. And so I mean it is something that this is just what happens in this day and age of the public internet.
Yeah. So the idea of data loss, data breaches, if you think about it right, somebody actually gaining access to it, malicious insider, like what we talked about, all these are actually different security risks that we have to worry about as well. The way that we access a public cloud provider, right? Whether because of the way that the cloud characteristics are defined, right? It can be on any platform, but remember that not every single platform has to actually make sure that everything is 100% secure all the time. And I don't mean that they don't try to, but because of the way that hackers end up working, they might be able to figure out like, hey, when Vaughn goes to her Office 365 account, I wonder if I can actually mock that portal up so that Vaughn thinks it's actually the real portal when it's actually going to my server instead. Okay. Well, again, things like that. The idea of the insecurity in terms of the interface that we might have to worry about and deal about as well. And then lastly, Vaughn likes to type in these passwords and she loves it. And all of a sudden, what she's actually done in one of her shows at some point is that she's typed in her actual real password and somebody was able to pause the screen and capture every single letter that she typed in. Oh, Vaughn, Vaughn, Vaughn. The very fact is now, whoever it is, the bizarro Vaughn that's out there, actually has now captured it, and now she hijacks Vaughn's account. And now she's spinning up a ton of different services that Vaughn's going to have to pay for, but using it for her own nefarious purposes. All that's actually very possible. So you have to worry about this. The ubiquitous nature of the public cloud also gives access to something that we already talked about previously as well as Vaughn, which is the realm of shadow IT can creep in very easily if you give somebody access to these types of accounts. Okay, it might be where Vaughn is actually waiting for a service to come up, and Vaughn goes, "Oh, forget it. I'm not going to wait for Ronnie to actually, do this." She just goes ahead and implements it herself, and Ronnie forgets, and there it is. Now she has her own essential shadow IT department and her own server that's actually operating outside the security policies that's actually been set up. Okay, the global scope of it means that also Vaughn could do it even at the comfort of her own home as she's sitting back watching her Netflix and deciding, I'm going to go ahead and create that server anyways, and that's just the way it's going to be. Okay, so all those are actually possible. So the idea of on large global scale, okay, there's actually security risks that we have to think about too. Okay, now the other one that we also want to talk about is the idea of control. Now, in my notes, I got to actually think about the idea. I actually indented this a little bit too far in, and you'll see that. I'll change it at least at some point here. Okay. The idea of control challenges. What do I mean by that? Vaughn, when you send something up to store in Dropbox, okay, I'm going to just pick because you said you use Dropbox. I like it. I love, it's always been at least good from when I've used it. Vaughn, where in the world is that file that you stored when you send it up to Dropbox? Is it stored here in the United States? Is it stored somewhere overseas? Is it stored in a particular server that you know about? Do you know where it's stored?
I have no clue. Like the actual physical
Yeah,
location.
like where is that? Yeah, where's that
I put
file
it in,
actually residing?
well, sometimes I forget what folder I even put in within my organization.
And so even that can be challenging. Okay, but imagine this: the very fact is we don't know where this data is actually stored. So if I go and retrieve the data, okay, well I can gain a copy of it, but how do I know that residual is not left over somewhere? Okay. So we can actually talk about the idea that we don't really know where the data is stored. We're just trusting that the company will do it for us. And all of us do it, right, if we use cloud services. And it's not picking on the idea of any particular provider that's out there. What I'm saying is we really don't. We don't know how this works. And that's part of the cloud, right? It's abstracting everything for us so that we don't get tied up in the complexities of, is it stored here or is it stored overseas somewhere? We don't really know.
It's that whole ignorance is bliss, but sometimes it can be a little scary.
Mm-hmm.
Just have to trust it.
Yeah, there's also something else that can happen, especially with virtualization, which is all the technology, the underlying technology that helps us in the cloud. Is we talk about the idea of technically they call it elasticity control. Now, what we mean here is what we call it server sprawl. Okay. Now, the idea of sprawl here means that Vaughn might have actually said, "Hey, I need to do this." And I might have actually realized something that I could have actually just accessed another server, put the application on that server that I needed to, okay, and not worry about it. But you want to know what's faster, Vaughn? I spin up one of those instances in AWS, and then I just run whatever you actually needed to on there. It's faster. I don't have to worry about reconfiguring anything. I don't have to worry about doing that. And now all of a sudden I go and take a look, and Vaughn, I'm running 50 servers. And then I realize something. Hey, I've only got 70 employees. Why am I actually running 50 different servers on my, even virtualized servers? That's a bit hefty. So the idea here of elasticity control is a big one. That's because it can grow out of hand very quickly, and each one of these can end up costing a lot of money.
Especially if you're not documenting it, or you're kind of saying somebody else is just willy-nilly spinning up servers and you don't even know about it. So the duplication can kind of get a little wonky.
Yeah. It really can. It can get out of hand very quickly if you're not actually administrating it very well as well. And that also comes to the idea, who actually changes stuff? So service administration, even though I have admission here on my notes, is administration, I believe, is what we're talking about here. Is Vaughn may go in and set up something, but she might have been talking to somebody else and then realize, oh yeah, I know that there's a setting in here that if I just change this, it'll work just fine. She didn't document it with anybody. Okay, so Vaughn has now made a major change inside of our network. She didn't tell anybody, and heck, maybe nobody actually notices, which is a good thing. But maybe all of a sudden everything breaks, and now I have to go, well, who has access to it? I go and look in the list. And let's say that I was lazy as an administrator, Vaughn, and I gave everybody administrative access to everything. Well, now I might be able to trace it back to Vaughn because I should be able to log in and see that. But at the same time, giving too much, permissions here to access everything, it can actually have a global change within my environment as well. Performance monitoring is also a big, unusual aspect of this as well. Vaughn, you may actually go, oh, here's what I'm going to do and get all this done. But we can't account for the heaviest days in which attacks can go on, or the idea that that cloud service provider may actually be handling a full and heavy load as well. Okay. So where I might go, I can't believe it. My particular service feels like it's lugged down. It's doing that. Well, again, we can't control the way that things happen. Let's say not even in the cloud provider network, but what about out here, Vaughn, in the internet? Okay. We can't control what speeds things go on out here. Sometimes we can actually lose some access to portions of the internet just because of the way that DNS ends up working. And that can actually kind of bring a slowdown to some of the things that we want as well. Okay. Management can be easy, but it also can be difficult depending on the steps that need to be set up. So all these are challenges in terms of the idea of the public cloud, okay, when we take a look. Okay. Our last particular challenge that we want to make sure that we understand here is the idea of cost. Risks. Okay. So risk and challenges. So notice that we have security risks, cost risks, but actual control challenges in terms of the cloud model that we're talking about here. Okay. Some of the different cost risks that we don't think about is something that I kind of mentioned in an earlier episode as well, Vaughn. That I can spin up a platform, okay, which we talked about, and if I go, hey, I don't need it anymore. If I hit the stop button, well, am I actually not paying for that anymore? Not necessarily. Okay.
We talked about the storage and the other resources that we might not realize when we just say stop.
Yeah.
Everything else is connected.
Yeah, it's still essentially taking up some resource on their end, so they're actually just going to charge you for that. Now, we've had this happen. I believe I was trying to think if I was one that did it, but it is possible that I'm the one that did it. But where we actually just stopped a server and we left it running for a month, and then the bill came in. We're like, okay, we left something running for a long time because that ended up costing us a little bit more than we thought. Actually, a lot more than we thought, and it's because we had stopped it, but we didn't actually get rid of that server that was actually running in terms of a virtualized server out on the cloud. Well, this same thing can happen as well, and that is because cloud providers, they are, I won't say hiding it, but they're good at nickeling and diming us, okay, in ways that you and I cannot even comprehend at times, okay, to actually be able to figure out like every aspect of this. So you might be able to get away with some of it and go, oh no, I kind of got an idea. And a lot of them now have actually gone to the point where like, look, there's calculations. There's actually calculators out here that can actually help you to figure out how much it's essentially going to cost you if you do this, so that you know that you're not getting overwhelmed by this stuff too. But they don't automatically warn you as far as like, hey, your bill has actually risen to this particular point after 3 weeks of you leaving it there. Why? Because they're saying, hey, when the next bill comes out, they'll know and then they'll fix it. Okay.
Oh, so there's no like warnings like, oh, you're reaching your threshold, or like, well, no. we're actually showing you.
If you hit a threshold, they do have those like where you can say, hey, up to $500 or whatever it is, then go ahead and send me a warning or go ahead and stop.
Oh, they do have, okay.
Yeah, but you have to actually be very aware of that. Okay. So if you're not aware of that and you go, oh, no, I'll just let it run. You can let it run. You're like me, after a show, you're trying to go, all right, let me get away. And you forget to even turn it off. And then there it is 2 days later, it's still running. You're like, oh, yeah, that's a bad thing. So just realize that that idea of the nickel and cost model is a big one too. Okay. Poor implementation costs. Poor implementation is a big one. Exactly what we talked about in terms of sprawl, that's actually the same thing. It costs us more when we continue to spin up more servers and we really didn't need it. Okay. Tracking usage is a hard one too. Now, when we talk about that idea, it's hard to actually model and forecast based on what we've already done in the public cloud because there's so many different things that can contribute, like the internet here. Okay, that's a big contributor. but also how you tend to use that particular service is hard to actually be able to have some type of tracking purpose. And even trying to discover the overall business focus of why you use the cloud may be a little bit more difficult than you think, because you might look and go, do I really need this server? Well, somebody needs it, or hopefully they wouldn't have actually built it up. But then you have to go back and try and figure this all out. And can you do that by just simply turning it off? And then Vaughn comes running like, what happened to my server? It's gone. It's down. Whatever my platform is, I can't use it anymore. And go, oh, I didn't know what it's for, so I just simply turned it off. Or even worse, Vaughn, I didn't know what it's for, so I deleted it. It's gone. And Vaughn goes, wait a minute. All my work for the last 6 months is gone? And I have to say, oh, yes, it's gone.
This kind of gets back to the implementation. Like when you were dealing with like actual physical hardware, you had to maybe do a little bit more prior planning because you had such limited scope, if you want to say.
Right.
Now it's kind of like it's free reign.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the opposite. So
it is.
Almost lends it to be less documenting, less kind of thinking it out step by step. Because it's like, oh, I can just spin that up. Oh,
Right.
I can just turn this off. And you just kind of willy-nilly do it if you're not careful and making sure that you're following like best practices.
Yeah. Once again, some of the drawbacks or some of the challenges of being someone that's just first introduced to using the cloud. And normally what wakes you up, Vaughn, is the very first bill when you've overspent, because it usually comes out to be a little bit more shocking than you actually expected it to be. And that's when you go, oh, yeah, let me make sure I keep track of this stuff a little bit better.
Like my long distance bill in college
Yes.
when you had to pay for long distance phone calls. Yeah.
No, it's the same. Yeah, it's the same aspect of things that we don't think about. Okay. But overall, though, when we start talking about this, notice I'm not really concerned about all the technology behind in the cloud provider network here, Vaughn. Okay. As far as the public it. Okay. But here it's about the idea of understanding at least the scope and the risk and challenges that we face. Now, these aren't the only ones that are out there, but Vaughn, at this point, this is actually a great overview of some of the things that's going to help you out as you get ready for the exam. But just that, the very fact is most of us are going to be using something like this. So if you go to AWS, like we said, that's a public cloud provider. Azure is another one. Google Compute, all these are actually big, gigantic global companies that want you to use their particular service provider as well. And they handle tons of different customers, okay? Doesn't matter whether they're business or whether they're actually individual consumers here. They don't care what devices that you use. They just want you to use their services and pay the actual cost for it. Now, once you do that, remember, you have to think about the idea of the security and the cost risk, as well as these challenges that we've just talked about. So that will help us to at least get started understanding the deployment model. That is the perspective that you understand, because that's who actually consumes or uses the actual service that's actually being provided by a cloud provider. So that's the standpoint that we need to think about the deployment models for, is how we're actually encountering it. And this is what we have to think about if we're going to be using it. Okay, so Vaughn, that is a good introduction, at least for what we're going to be thinking about in terms of a public cloud. So we still have 3 other deployment models that we need to cover, but that'll be for a different episode.
All right. Well, good to start with the one that we're probably most familiar with. So thank you, Ronnie, for all that great information. And thank you for joining us. But we are going to sign off for IT Pro TV. I have been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.